Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I take Kim's point before the break that if the goal is to convince Randy Weingarten, the head of the American Federation of Teachers Union, that charter schools are working, that is probably never going to happen, because this report seems to suggest that there is a better alternative to the way that these union-led and union-run schools are operating, and that they're essentially failing and falling down on the job of teaching many of America's kids. But Bill, I wonder about Democrats who maybe have even recently voted against charter expansions, and they may be more open to considering in the future. And I'd point to New York because, again, to repeat these numbers, this Credo report says that in New York, charter students are 75 days ahead in reading and 73 days ahead in math compared with traditional public schools. And New York City particularly is a place where there is a political limit on the expansion of charter schools. There are wait lists, there are families, students who want in, and there are not enough seats because of legal barriers that have been set up. And Bill, I wonder if you can remind us, because New York Governor Kathy Hochul put a little bit of capital into raising those political barriers, but I guess in my view, not as much capital as she should have put into this. But I wonder if you can remind us about this debate that has played out over the last several months in New York.
Yeah, the bottom line is Kathy Hochul got rolled. In last year's run for governor, she said that she supported lifting the cap on charter schools. There's a state cap of about 460, and there's a New York City cap about 275. So she rightly said she was for lifting it because that's the greatest obstacle to expansion in New York. But when it came time to really take on the unions and stuff, she kind of proposed a halfway house where they wouldn't eliminate the cap, but they would allow New York City to open unused charter schools like the numbers for the state. If the rest of the state wasn't hitting the numbers and fit under the overall cap, they could go to New York. That was as much as I think with their changes, she's proposing more than 100 new charters. In the end, she got only 15 in New York City. So a real disappointment. And I think it's a textbook case of what's going on. If we went by the science, Eva Moskowitz, CEO of Success Academy Schools, which stacks up not just well against charters and the best public schools out there, should be running the whole system. But she has to fight every way, and the political class is just so wed to keeping these charters. Albany is a real obstruction. And I kind of agree with Kim. The difference is, with the pandemic, people saw that their public schools no longer had the interests of the students, number one. And parents saw this firsthand. And so more and more people, school choice has been largely conservative Republican cause. A lot more people who are not conservative Republicans saw this as the only way to get their kids the education they need and deserve. So the story's not over, but right now, unfortunately, the cap in New York still exists. And there are similar stories throughout the states because the teachers' unions hate charter schools because they prove that kids can be educated, that all the things Kim mentioned that they cite, structural racism, different handicaps, they all don't matter if you get the right school teaching the kids. And what Eva Moskowitz does with her students should be a model for the rest of the country.
Well, I agree with Bill that it has been parents and voters who have really pushed the school choice movement forward, and Democratic legislatures have often been opposed to it and been dragged kicking and screaming to this idea. But Kim, the next time this comes up in debate in New York, I don't know if it'll be next year as part of the budget, it does seem to me that the pro-school choice, pro-charter movement and all the parents that are in charters, all the parents that are sitting on the waiting lists will have a pretty good argument here. They can go to those legislators who voted against lifting the cap this year, and they can say, look at these results. My kid is on this waiting list. And if you look at the results, charter students in New York are 2.5 months ahead of traditional public schools. Why are you trying to deny that to my students, to my children, to all the rest of the children on this waiting list? Why not open up that opportunity to everybody? And boy, I think that's a pretty politically powerful argument.
Well, the case has already been made. There was a poll back in February in New York. It was conducted by Democrats for Education Reform, and it only polled New York City Democrats. And the results were very striking. Overall, 51% compared to 21% of Democrats favored more charters. The numbers were even more striking when you went to different groups. Hispanics, 53 to 26, African Americans, 48 to 23. But here's the number that really jumped out to me. If you just asked parents, 64% of them supported the charter school movement. And you actually have to ask yourself, wonder if the vast majority of those who are opposed are probably wealthy, wealthy New Yorkers who already send their kids to a private school and feel as though they need to push back against charters because they have to ally themselves with the progressive left. The reality is that the majority of parents, the ones whose kids are in failing schools, already understand the merit of this. And yes, as noted, you see this. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. Bill and Kyle, you've been doing this a long time. We've been through many years where we saw that early Credo report and, there were a handful of charters here or there. It is really remarkable what's happening across the country at the moment, just how quickly this is expanding. And I say this all along. As we were sitting there in the pandemic and the unions kept refusing to go back to school and schools said shut down, and the parents, you could feel the anger. It was so palpable. I think they really dug a deep way into their own grave during that period of time. And we are now seeing the inevitable result. And that is a result of parents really having got the lesson during the pandemic that the teachers unions, by and large, they do not care about the kids. Okay. And if they want to send their child to an organization where there's a community, where there's a chance of success, and where there's a board that's focused on getting things done, and where the kids really are put first.
Meantime, as charter schools continue to expand, one interesting wrinkle that is arising and maybe possibly coming to a Supreme Court near you is the idea of a religious charter school. And to make clear the distinction here, there are some states where there are private school choice programs. So the money goes to the parent, to the family, and the family makes their own choice, which may be a parochial school, a religious school. And then there are charter schools. Charter advocates have often said that they are public schools. They are funded by the state, although they are run by some sort of charter, private, nonprofit, or sometimes for-profit management organization. And Bill, recently a Oklahoma virtual charter school board approved what is set to be the nation's first religious charter school. It's a Catholic virtual school. And my understanding of the story here is that the idea came up during the pandemic, and parents and kids, families, teachers were figuring out that maybe virtual learning is an option in the way that they hadn't considered it before. And so the local diocese there decided that they would set up a Catholic virtual school and try to reach rural students out of the area who may want that kind of education and had been inaccessible before. But interesting, Bill, that there was probably going to be a court challenge to this, saying that how can a public school be a religious school? And I wonder what you make of that.
It's an interesting dilemma. I think when charter schools started, there was the idea, given the Supreme Court's decisions at the time about religion, the idea was this was kind of a halfway house to school choice. There'd be public schools, but they wouldn't be subject to the rules of the other public schools and so forth. So it kind of satisfied people if they, we got more kids, some choice, some good schools. Now, with the different rulings the court has given on religion, the debate has shifted, and a lot of it depends on whether you consider these schools a state actor, like acting for the government. The Oklahoma school says it's not. It's acting as a private contractor. And since the court has ruled that if you have a government program with funds and you offer it to everyone, you can't then say no religious groups need apply. that doesn't fly. So I see the logic of the Oklahoma school. I think it's going to be hard to persuade the court that it's unconstitutional given their other rulings. That said, one of the strong arguments for school choice, for more like vouchers, is the money was going to the students and the families and not the school. So this changes that. But given the recent rulings by the court on the right of religious groups to compete for those dollars, the only way I think they can declare it unconstitutional is to say the schools are state actors. And then they have a lot of problems with that, too.
And that question could be coming to the Supreme Court rather soon. Kim, there was a ruling from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals recently around a charter school that had a dress policy requiring girls to wear jumpers, skirts, or skirts on most days. And that was held to violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause based on the idea that the charter school is a state actor. And so you could see an appeal of that come up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decide that one way or another. And it is a bit of a dilemma. I agree with Bill here. On the one hand, you're going to have one side say that there will be religious content taught in these schools. If it's a public school, how can that possibly not be a violation of the Establishment Clause, saying that the government can't establish a religion? And on the other hand, there are all sorts of other contexts where the government deals with private actors. Adoption agencies is one, where a Catholic group, Catholic Social Services, may run an adoption service that is contracted by a city or state. And I don't think in that context, anyone views the city or the state as establishing a religion by contracting with a religious group to perform that kind of a function. So, Kim, I don't know, maybe we will see this here soon at the Supreme Court, but we will give you the last word for today.
Yeah, there's a couple of problems with this Fourth Circuit ruling, and I do hope it's one that's taken up by the Supreme Court. It's certainly a case that is ripe for the court to step in and find judgment. Charter Day School, the school here, one problem is that, well, the Fourth Circuit essentially declared it a state actor. The problem is that that's contrary to North Carolina law. CDS is actually a private nonprofit, which, by the way, is a legal requirement for operating a charter in the state. You must be something outside of the state. You must be a private nonprofit. So just because the court declared CDS a state actor, it doesn't make it so. I think the other thing, though, Kyle, is what you mentioned, is that the logic here is extremely messy and would threaten all manner of other government-funded programs, meaning we all the time bid out contracts for companies to provide services to the state or to the federal government. For instance, contractors who work on building your roads. Is anyone going to suggest that just because public money is going to that entity for a job that suddenly it becomes a state actor? That's just nonsense. And that's before you get to all of these other organizations that provide social services on behalf of the government, groups that receive grants and they're engaged in drug rehab programs, groups, organizations, sometimes Christian ministries that deal with food banks, etc. Often they are getting government funds to help provide their services. So all of that would potentially be at risk if this ruling were to continue to stand. So especially, Bill mentioned the Supreme Court has had a couple of very good rulings lately making some of these distinctions, including one just a couple of years ago in which it said that a state voucher program could not discriminate against religious schools. I agree with him entirely. I find it, if this case were to go up there or one similar to it, I find it very difficult to see how the court will come down on the side of arguing that these organizations are state actors and therefore somehow subject to very strict interpretations under the Establishment Clause.
Thank you, Kim and Bill. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.